1939 to 1945. People think of World War II. A familiar picture forms almost instantly. They think of American troops storming Omaha Beach. They think of the Royal Navy ruling the Atlantic. They think of British generals, American firepower, and a war won by the loudest voices in history. But there is another country, one that fought from the first days of the war to the final hours in Europe, whose name often fades somewhere between the footnotes and the phrase the Allies, Canada. This is not a story about conspiracy. There were no secret meetings, no deliberate plot to erase a nation from the history books. What happened was quieter and far more common. The credit drifted. Headlines rolled on from American beaches. While the world followed decisive moments, Canada was assigned the work that made those moments possible. While victory speeches were written, Canada was still clearing ports, escorting convoys, and bleeding through mud, streets, and flooded fields. By the end of the war, Canada had landed on D-Day, fought through Normandy, opened the port that fed the Allied advance, kept the Atlantic lifeline alive, shattered German defenses in Italy, liberated an entire nation in northwestern Europe, and paid a brutal price in battles history rarely names. Yet decades later, much of the world remembers these victories as British, or American, or simply Allied. It lost visibility. And once credit slips out of the story, once memory reshapes itself around power, media, and myth, it rarely returns on its own. This documentary is not about resentment. It is about recognition. It is about how one of the largest Allied war efforts of World War II slowly vanished from popular memory. Not because it failed, but because it fought quietly, consistently, and under someone else's banner. To understand how that happened, we have to begin before the first landing craft hit the sand, before the first convoy crossed the Atlantic. We have to understand why Canada's credit kept disappearing. 1939 to 1943, the Shadow War. Canada entered World War II in September 1939, not as a colony, but as a sovereign nation that chose war on its own terms. Parliament voted. The declaration was signed. Canada was in. Yet, from the very beginning, Canada's war would be fought inside someone else's shadow. Canada did not command its own independent global theater. It did not control the grand strategy. Instead, Canadian forces were almost always embedded inside British command structures, later alongside growing American power. On maps, Canadian sectors were often labeled British. In reports, victories were attributed to corps, armies, or allied formations rather than nations. This structural reality planted the first seed of disappearance. Canada fought under British command not because it lacked ability, but because that was how the Commonwealth war effort functioned. The price of coordination was identity. When operations succeeded, the banner above them rarely said Canada. Then came the second factor, how the war was remembered, not how it was fought. After 1941, the United States entered the war with unmatched industrial power and unmatched storytelling reach. Hollywood followed American soldiers. Journalists followed American commanders. Post-war films, books, and classrooms framed the conflict through American entry points and climactic moments. Canada, meanwhile, had no global film industry shaping memory. No cultural machine reinforcing its role. The third factor was perhaps the most damaging. Canada was often given the hardest jobs, not the loudest ones. Canada fought where progress was slow, where terrain was brutal. Clearing ports, holding ground, fighting in Italy for years without a single decisive battle. Urban combat that destroyed companies but produced no iconic photographs. These victories did not look like triumph. They looked like endurance. And endurance rarely becomes legend. Even when Canada succeeded, it did so quietly. Canadian leaders rarely demanded recognition. There was no post-war campaign to reclaim credit. Canada returned to civilian life, rebuilt its economy, and allowed the story to move on without correction. By the time historians began reassessing the war decades later, the narrative was already fixed. Britain planned, America delivered, someone else filled in the rest. Canada became part of that vague middle space, essential, present, but unnamed. This was not theft in the criminal sense. It was something more subtle. Credit flowed toward power, visibility, and voice. And Canada, despite its enormous contribution, had less of all three. The result was a historical paradox. Canada fought in nearly every major Western Allied campaign of the war. Yet, its name is absent from how most people remember victory. To see how this played out in real battles, not theory, we have to go to the places where Canada fought, bled, and succeeded, and where history slowly forgot to say its name. June 6, 1944, the beach that worked. History had already chosen its favorite beach. Omaha would become the symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the turning point of the war in Western Europe. Films would be made about it. Books would be written around it. Entire generations would grow up believing that D-Day was fought and nearly lost on a single stretch of American shoreline. Yet, 80 kilometers to the east, another landing unfolded under fire just as deadly, obstacles just as unforgiving, and objectives just as ambitious. This was Juno Beach. Assigned to the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, Juno was among the most complex landing zones. German defenses were dense and intact. Coastal villages turned streets into killing lanes. Sea conditions were rough. Landing craft were delayed. Infantry arrived without armor support. The first waves paid dearly. Yet, unlike Omaha, where momentum stalled for hours, Canadian units adapted with speed and discipline. Small groups pushed inland, bypassing strongpoints. Engineers cleared exits under fire. By afternoon, Canadian troops had broken through. By nightfall, elements of the Canadian Division had pushed farther inland than any other Allied force on D-Day. This was not a marginal success. It was one of the most effective landings of the invasion. Yet, the story of D-Day hardened into legend. Juno faded. Why? Part of the answer lies in perception. Omaha's near disaster fit the dramatic arc of sacrifice and redemption. Juno's success looked almost routine by comparison, despite being anything but. History has a habit of mistaking efficiency for ease. Structurally, Juno lay within the Anglo-Canadian sector, often simplified in maps and narratives as British. When the story was retold, national distinctions blurred. And then there was timing. By the time journalists arrived, the most decisive moments at Juno were over. The beachhead had been secured. There was no single iconic image to anchor public memory. No cliff assault. No last stand tableau. Canada did not give history the image it wanted. It gave history the result it needed. In classrooms, D-Day became Omaha with footnotes. In documentaries, Juno was a paragraph. In popular memory, Canada's role was folded neatly into the phrase, British forces landed nearby. Juno was not forgotten because it failed. It was forgotten because it worked. And that, in many ways, would become the pattern of Canada's war. June-August 1944, the war after the cameras left. The world remembers Normandy as a single day, June 6, 1944. But for the soldiers, D-Day was only the opening act. When the cameras packed up, Normandy became a grinding, methodical war fought field by field, village by village. In that long, punishing phase, Canada was asked to hold, advance, absorb losses, and keep going. The Canadian sector contained some of Normandy's most difficult terrain. Progress was measured in hundreds of meters, not miles. Battles like Caen became emblematic of this brutal struggle, weeks of absorbing German counterattacks, pinning down enemy units that might otherwise have been thrown against American forces to the west. From a strategic perspective, this mattered enormously. Every German tank held in the Canadian sector was a tank not attacking elsewhere. But this kind of success does not look heroic on a map. It looks like stagnation. Holding the line rarely earns praise. By the time the Allied breakout came, Canadian forces had suffered heavy losses for ground that barely seemed to move. In popular retellings, this was often framed as slow progress, or worse, failure. What was missed was the purpose. Canada's role was to hold the line, draw German strength, and grind down resistance until collapse became inevitable elsewhere. There were no parades for holding actions. No monuments to attrition. But without those weeks, without Canada absorbing pressure when it mattered most, the story of Normandy would have ended very differently. History tends to reward the moment of movement. It forgets the cost of standing still. And in Normandy, after the cameras left, Canada stood its ground. September-November 1944, the battle that fed the advance. The Allies captured Antwerp, one of Europe's largest ports, almost intact. On paper, a triumph. In reality, Antwerp was useless. German forces still controlled the Scheldt estuary, the waterway connecting the port to the sea. The task of opening the Scheldt fell primarily to the 1st Canadian Army. This was not a glorious assignment. It involved fighting in flooded lowlands, narrow dikes, and muddy fields under constant fire. The terrain favored the defender completely. There were no dramatic breakthroughs. Only grinding progress, paid for meter by bloody meter. Canadian infantry units, already worn from Normandy, were pushed to their limits. Yet, strategically, nothing mattered more. Without Antwerp, Allied supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers back to Normandy. Fuel shortages slowed advances. The Scheldt was the bottleneck. Open it, and the war could move forward. Fail, and the advance would stall. By November 1944, after weeks of relentless fighting, the German hold on the estuary finally collapsed. Antwerp opened. The effect was immediate and transformative. Supplies poured in. Armies moved again. Yet when victory came, the Scheldt barely registered. There were no victory headlines, no iconic dates. It was labeled accurately but fatally, the forgotten battle. Once again, Canada disappeared inside the result. The irony was profound. The battle that made the Allied victory logistically possible was won without fanfare. It was not dramatic. It was essential. The longest battle, the Atlantic, 1939 to 1945. Long before D-Day and long after, Canada was fighting the longest battle of World War II, the Battle of the Atlantic. It had no single front, no decisive day, and lasted nearly 6 years. For most of that time, Canada was at its center. When the war began, Canada's navy was small. Yet geography placed it astride the vital sea lanes connecting North America to Britain. Canada committed itself to escorting merchant ships across the most dangerous waters on Earth. This was a war of routine terror, cold, exhaustion, and the constant threat of U-boats. Canada's responsibility grew. Its navy transformed itself at a staggering pace. By the middle of the war, Canadian escorts guarded vast stretches of the Atlantic. Losses were heavy. But slowly, the balance shifted. By war's end, Canada possessed one of the world's largest navies, built through attrition and endurance. Its sailors had escorted countless convoys, delivering the food, fuel, and troops that made every Allied operation possible. And yet, when the Battle of the Atlantic is remembered, the spotlight falls on the Royal Navy or the United States Navy. Canada is mentioned only in passing. Canada did not win the Atlantic in a single dramatic engagement. It won by showing up every day for 6 years. There were no triumphant landings, just thousands of voyages that arrived safely because someone was there to protect them. The Atlantic was the war beneath the war, and Canada fought it every single day. Italy, 1943 to 1944, the savage proving ground. The Allied campaign in Italy became a slow, punishing fight across mountains and ancient cities. For Canada, it was one of the war's most brutal proving grounds. Then came Ortona. A medieval town on the Adriatic became the stage for one of the war's most savage urban battles. German paratroopers defended with skill and tenacity. Narrow streets turned every corner into an ambush. Canadian infantry adapted, developing a brutal method called mauseling, blasting through walls to advance from room to room. The fighting was so intense Ortona earned the nickname Little Stalingrad. It fell not through maneuver, but persistence. Yet in post-war memory, the Italian campaign was often dismissed as a sideshow, overshadowed by Normandy. Canada's success there lacked spectacle. It lacked a defining image. And so once again, credit drifted away. Canada had fought one of the fiercest urban battles of the war, and history barely paused to acknowledge it. 1945, the liberation that remembered. By the winter of 1944-45, the Netherlands remained trapped under German occupation, facing this hunger winter. Into this frozen landscape came the 1st Canadian Army. The liberation was deliberate and dangerous. Canadian soldiers advanced through flooded fields and ruined towns. But unlike other campaigns, the people waiting were not invisible. Dutch civilians, weak and malnourished, greeted Canadian troops as deliverers. As the German position collapsed, Canadian forces accepted surrenders and transitioned to relief operations. For the Dutch, this was not an abstract Allied victory. It was survival. When the war ended, Canada's role in the Netherlands was undeniable to those who lived it. And unlike other places, the Dutch never let that memory fade. Decades later, Canadian soldiers are remembered by name. Streets bear their names. Graves are meticulously cared for. In the Netherlands, Canada did not disappear into the Allies. Canada was seen. The first chapter, Hong Kong, 1941. Long before Normandy, Canada went to war in the Far East. In 1941, 2 Canadian battalions were sent to reinforce Hong Kong. Days after their arrival, Japanese forces attacked. The battle was hopeless from the start. Outnumbered and isolated, the garrison fought a desperate defense before surrendering on Christmas Day. For Canadian prisoners of war, a brutal captivity began. Hong Kong was the war's first great trauma for Canada. But it did not fit the narrative of victory. It was a defeat, a prelude overshadowed by the vast Pacific War. And so it faded. Canada's first chapter of World War II quietly vanished from popular memory. Epilogue: The Drift of Memory. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world rushed to explain what had happened. It needed a story that was clear, powerful, and easy to remember. Canada did not fit the shape of that story. There was no single Canadian moment that ended the war. No iconic image. Instead, there was something harder to package. Canada fought everywhere it was needed. It did the work that kept the war moving rather than ending it. It endured the long battles that made the short victories possible. So was Canada's credit stolen? Not in the way theft usually happens. What happened was quieter and far more common in history. Credit drifted toward power, toward visibility, and toward those who controlled how the story would be told. But forgetting does not mean insignificance. At Juno Beach, Canada advanced farther than anyone expected. In Normandy, it held the line when movement stalled. At the Scheldt, it opened the port that fed victory. Across the Atlantic, it protected the lifeline of a continent. In Italy, it fought one of the war's fiercest urban battles. In the Netherlands, it liberated a nation that still remembers. In Hong Kong, it paid the price of commitment before the war was fully understood. These are not footnotes. They are foundations. History often remembers those who speak the loudest, move the fastest, or arrive at the end. It forgets those who endure, adapt, and hold the line when no one is watching. Canada was never missing from World War II. It was always there, standing in the background, carrying more of the weight than the story ever admitted. Recognition does not change the past, but it changes how we understand it. And once Canada's role is seen clearly, the question is no longer whether its achievements were stolen, but why it took the world so long to remember them.